In the mountains of northern Mexico, nestled within the rugged terrain of the Sierra Madre, lies a story that seems almost too dark to be true, a tale of manipulation, blood rituals, and chilling deception. At the center of it all is Magdalena Solis, a woman whose rise to power would leave a lasting mark on the small, isolated village of La Yerba Buena. What began as a seemingly innocent con would soon unravel into a grotesque series of events that shocked the world. Magdalena, along with the Hernandez brothers, masterminded a cult that preyed on the vulnerable villagers. These were poor, illiterate people, easily influenced by the persuasive words of those who promised them wealth and salvation. Little did they know that their newfound leaders were not mere con artists but something far more sinister. As the Hernandez brothers established their false prophet status, it was Magdalena who would assume a role far more terrifying, transforming herself into a self-proclaimed reincarnated Incan goddess. The villagers, hungry for hope, believed her completely, falling in line with her every command. But the truth behind the so-called goddess's power was darker than anyone could have imagined. Magdalena's influence soon expanded beyond mere manipulation, spiraling into blood rituals that would become the cult's horrifying trademark. It started with sacrifices to prove her divine powers, initially using animals. But soon, the sacrifices escalated. Human blood was needed to sustain the power she had claimed. Magdalena's delusion grew stronger with every drop of blood spilled, and with it, her control over the villagers tightened. No one was safe from her influence, not even the people she once called allies. The story takes a sharp turn when a 14-year-old boy named Sebastián Guerrero, unaware of the horrors taking place within the caves near his village, stumbles upon the grisly truth. Drawn by a flickering light emanating from one of the cave entrances, Sebastián's innocent curiosity leads him to a discovery that would change the course of his life forever. What he witnessed inside that cave was beyond anything he could have prepared for, a scene so horrific it sent him running to the local authorities, desperate to get help. However, convincing the police was no easy task. At first, they dismissed Sebastián's claims as the wild imagination of a frightened boy. It wasn't until Officer Luis Martinez joined the investigation that the cult's grip on the village would begin to unravel. Together, they ventured back to the cave, unaware that their lives were about to be changed in ways they could not have predicted. As Sebastián and Officer Martinez stood on the precipice of an investigation that would reveal the truth behind the cult's terrifying rituals, their courage would lead them directly into the heart of danger. The horrors that lay hidden within the cave were only the beginning of a violent showdown that would involve not just the police, but the Mexican army as well. The chilling discovery inside that cave would soon lead to a full-blown raid, as authorities battled the cult's members in a deadly confrontation. The village of La Yerba Buena, once a place of simple, quiet lives, was now the epicenter of a horrifying story of cults, betrayal, and bloodshed. But the fight for justice was just beginning. As the investigation deepens, more revelations unfold. The story of Magdalena Solis and the Hernandez brothers would not end quietly. It would take a full military intervention to bring the nightmare to an end, and when the truth finally came to light, the consequences would be just as monstrous as the cult's rituals. The Hernandez brothers had long planned their deception. They were no strangers to trickery, having swindled towns and individuals throughout the region. However, they had always been limited by the nature of their scams, small-time cons targeting the unsuspecting. But in the small, isolated village of La Yerba Buena, they saw an opportunity for something much bigger, something that could grant them more power than they had ever imagined. Their target was a village full of poor, illiterate people, many of whom were cut off from the outside world and vulnerable to persuasion. It was the perfect setting for their grandest con yet. The brothers crafted a story so elaborate that it would bind the villagers to them in ways they couldn't have foreseen. They claimed to be the prophets of an ancient Incan god, a deity that had been exiled long ago. The Hernandez brothers spun their tale of divine power, speaking with such conviction that the villagers, desperate for a glimmer of hope, believed them completely. They were promised riches, safety, and prosperity, all in exchange for their unquestioning loyalty. The villagers, trusting and eager for change, fell for it. But the true twist in the brothers' plan came with the arrival of Magdalena Solis. At first, she was just a pawn in the brothers' scheme, a woman they would dress up as the goddess to solidify their ruse. But Magdalena's involvement would change everything. She was charismatic, stunning, and far more ambitious than the brothers anticipated. When she stepped into the role of the Incan goddess, something inside her shifted. She began to believe in her own divinity. The power and reverence the villagers showed her intoxicated her. What was once a performance for the sake of the Khan became her reality. She wasn't just pretending to be a goddess, she believed she was one. The manipulation that followed was insidious. With the Hernandez brothers' support, Magdalena took control of the village, demanding unwavering obedience. She established strict rules and rituals, each more disturbing than the last. What began as a simple con for material gain became something much darker, a cult. The villagers, initially skeptical, were now fully under her control, hypnotized by her commanding presence and the promise of divine favor. Those who resisted her were punished or silenced. And it didn't stop there. The first blood ritual was introduced subtly, under the guise of a ceremonial offering to the gods. Magdalena, in her twisted belief, demanded that the villagers sacrifice animals to prove their devotion. What began as a harmless act soon escalated. The need for animal sacrifice gave way to a demand for human blood. Magdalena began to believe that consuming human blood was necessary for her to maintain her immortality, her godly status. The villagers, terrified and brainwashed, began to carry out her orders without question. They slaughtered animals at first, but soon, they were asked to offer their own. Magdalena's transformation into a full-fledged deity figure was complete when she no longer cared about the truth of her own story. She had convinced herself, and everyone around her, that she was indeed a reincarnated goddess, destined to rule over La Yerba Buena. Her commands were law, her rituals non-negotiable. The brothers, once the masterminds of the Khan, were now mere followers, fearful of challenging her authority. She had become the ultimate power in the village, a tyrant disguised as a divine figure. The first blood rituals were only the beginning. Magdalena's insatiable thirst for power and control led to more gruesome acts. As she continued to brainwash the villagers into believing they were acting under divine orders, the boundaries of decency and morality blurred. What was once a simple scam had evolved into a nightmarish cult, centered around blood sacrifices, mind control, and the complete subjugation of an entire community. Magdalena had become not just the face of the cult, but the very heart of it. With every passing day, the grip of the cult on La Yerba Buena grew stronger. What was once a peaceful village was now a place of fear and obedience. The villagers were left with no choice but to follow Magdalena's demands. The Hernandez brothers, though still present, had lost control of the situation. Their Khan had turned into a full-blown nightmare, and they were too afraid of Magdalena to do anything about it. The cult was now her domain, and it would take an extraordinary act of courage to break free. The seeds of rebellion, however, were already sown. There were whispers among the villagers, those who secretly doubted the authenticity of the goddess and her rituals. They feared the consequences of challenging Magdalena but were also horrified by the path the village was taking. The next phase of this dark journey would see a boy's discovery of the truth, and a fight for survival against the monstrous power that had taken root in La Yerba Buena. As we move deeper into the tale, the story takes a chilling turn. Sebastián Guerrero, a curious 14-year-old boy, would soon discover what was happening in the cave, setting off a chain of events that would lead to the eventual downfall of Magdalena's cult. What he witnessed would change everything, exposing the cult's horrific practices and triggering a desperate search for justice. In the following sections, we will see how Sebastián's bravery and the intervention of the police ignited a horrifying investigation that led to the truth being uncovered. The final consequences of Magdalena's reign would be nothing short of shocking. Stay tuned as we delve into the moment that would ultimately bring an end to the bloodshed. The power that Magdalena Solis began to wield over La Yerba Buena was rooted in her ability to manipulate belief itself. At first, the blood rituals were presented as harmless offerings to the Incan gods, a small price to pay for the promised wealth and prosperity. The villagers, desperate and impoverished, believed wholeheartedly in the brothers' tale of divine intervention. The Hernandez brothers, crafty as they were, had a simple plan: deceive the villagers into following their every command by convincing them that the deities of their ancient past had returned, ready to offer them salvation. Magdalena's arrival was supposed to solidify the con, and in doing so, she played her part as the goddess, hiding her true intentions behind the guise of divine authority. But what was meant to be a performance soon became a terrifying reality. At first, the rituals were relatively simple. Animals, goats, chickens, and even the occasional pig were sacrificed under the pretense of appeasing the gods. The villagers watched in awe as Magdalena performed her ceremonial acts, chanting and singing in what she claimed was the ancient tongue of the Incas. The Hernandez brothers, thrilled by the success of their deception, took a step back, allowing Magdalena to take center stage. They could not have predicted how the taste of power would intoxicate her. Slowly, the rituals began to escalate. At first, Magdalena demanded only the blood of animals, which was easy enough for the villagers to provide. But soon, animal sacrifices no longer satisfied her growing thirst for power. It was not enough for her to simply perform these rituals. She began to believe that she herself needed to consume the blood of her sacrifices in order to retain her divine status. Magdalena's transformation into a true believer in her own godly nature was as swift as it was disturbing. She convinced herself that drinking human blood was the key to her immortality. The power of the village, the control she now held over the villagers, was tied to her ability to maintain her connection to the gods. And so, the first human sacrifice was made. It was a quiet night when Magdalena, with the Hernandez brothers at her side, ordered the sacrifice of a young villager. The villagers, terrified of the goddess, followed her commands without question. The ritual was brutal. The victim was bound and brought before Magdalena, who took her knife and, with chilling calmness, ended their life. As the blood flowed, she drank from the chalice in a frenzy, her eyes wide with ecstasy. The act, while revolting to the villagers, solidified her power in their minds. The horror didn't stop there. Magdalena's hunger for blood grew insatiable, and with it, the fear of the villagers. They had been deceived into believing that they were under the protection of a powerful goddess, but the truth was far worse. Magdalena's control over the village deepened as she twisted the villagers' fear into submission. Those who dared to question her were silenced either through force or fear. She had become a tyrant, no longer just a figurehead of a cult but the embodiment of terror itself. The human sacrifices became a regular occurrence. Every few days, Magdalena would select another victim, often from among the most vulnerable villagers. The fear in the village grew palpable, as families whispered in hushed voices about the next ritual. But there was nowhere to run, no escape from the grip of the goddess. Magdalena demanded more and more, her thirst for blood fueling the darkness that was consuming the village. The Hernandez brothers, who had once been the leaders of this scheme, now found themselves relegated to the role of mere followers. They were too afraid of Magdalena to challenge her, and so, with each passing day, they witnessed her descend into madness. As the rituals grew more grotesque, the villagers' resistance became even more desperate. They began to whisper among themselves, plotting to escape, to stop the bloodshed. But every time they tried to act, fear of Magdalena's wrath silenced them. It was not just the threat of death that kept them in line, it was the fear of becoming a sacrifice themselves. Magdalena had cultivated such absolute terror that even the thought of defying her seemed unthinkable. Her grip on the villagers was total, and it seemed like nothing could stop her reign of terror. The first time the villagers tried to resist was when Magdalena selected a beloved local family as the next victims. Two brave souls, fueled by their growing hatred of the cult, decided to flee in the dead of night. They had seen enough, and they could no longer stand by as the blood of their people stained the ground. However, their escape was discovered, and when Magdalena found out, she was furious. She gathered the villagers in the cave for a special ceremony, as she had done so many times before. The rest of the villagers, fearing their own demise, complied. Magdalena pointed to the two dissenters and, with chilling finality, demanded that the villagers punish them. The rest of the group, brainwashed by fear, fell on the two escapees with savage ferocity. They were beaten to death in the cave, their bodies strung up on pikes as Magdalena ordered the final ritual, drinking their blood. As the human sacrifices continued, the villagers grew numb to the horror. It was as though they had become desensitized to the violence, their survival instincts overridden by the psychological control Magdalena had over them. It was in this state of terror and helplessness that the darkest rituals of all began to take shape. Magdalena, now fully immersed in her belief that she was a goddess, ordered the brutal killings to be done more efficiently. The victims were no longer merely sacrificed in the traditional sense. Now, Magdalena insisted that they be killed while still alive. She would have them beaten to near death, then strung up on the pikes while their hearts were carved out. Only then would she drink the blood from the chalice. This relentless cycle of bloodshed and terror continued, and as Magdalena's influence spread, so too did the horror that clung to La Yerba Buena. The village, once a peaceful, isolated community, had become a macabre kingdom ruled by a woman who believed herself to be untouchable. Her madness had consumed not just the villagers but her own mind as well. There was no escaping the web of control she had woven, and with each passing day, the power she held grew stronger. But as with all reigns of terror, there is always a breaking point. The villagers, now broken and living in fear, would soon realize that their only hope for survival lay in revealing the truth behind the goddess and her horrific rituals. Yet, for many, that realization would come too late. The growing sense of unease and the mounting violence would eventually bring a young boy and a brave police officer to the cave. Their discovery would mark the beginning of the end for Magdalena's reign. The nightmare of La Yerba Buena was about to be exposed, and the true scale of the terror would be revealed to the world. But even as the authorities moved in, Magdalena's madness would prove to be a force as dangerous as any weapon. In the next chapter, we will see how the cult's terrifying hold was finally broken and the consequences that followed for those who had participated in the blood rituals. The shocking truth would soon be brought to light, leaving La Yerba Buena forever changed. Sebastián Guerrero had never thought much of the mountain caves that dotted the Sierra Madre, except for the occasional rumors of hidden treasures that seemed to linger in the wind. But that night, as he ventured higher into the mountains, everything changed. His heart pounded in his chest as he trudged up the rocky path, the moonlight casting eerie shadows over the jagged landscape. Sebastián was familiar with these caves, having wandered them before, but tonight was different. There was a strange light spilling from one of the cave entrances, an unnatural glow that stirred his curiosity. Approaching the cave cautiously, he heard sounds drifting through the cool night air, laughter. No, it wasn't laughter. It was more like a scream. A cry of pain, raw and agonizing. The sound made Sebastián's stomach twist in fear. His instincts screamed for him to turn back, but the peculiar curiosity that had driven him up the mountain now had him frozen in place. He had to know what was happening. Every step toward the cave seemed to drag him deeper into an unknown terror. As he reached the cave entrance, his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the cave, he could make out the silhouette of a figure. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps an illusion in the shadows. But no, the figure was real, and what they were doing was far worse than he could have imagined. Blood splattered across the stone floor, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of it. People, the villagers he had known all his life, were there, kneeling around a grotesque altar. And at the center stood Magdalena Solis, the self-proclaimed Incan goddess, holding a ceremonial knife that gleamed red in the flickering light. Sebastián's pulse raced as the chilling reality of the scene set in. The villagers weren't there out of devotion, they were there out of fear. Fear of Magdalena. Fear of the rituals that had been twisted into something monstrous. She wasn't just a leader. She was a goddess, a tyrant in disguise. She had seduced the villagers into believing she was an ancient deity come back to life, ready to bestow power upon them, but at what cost? The cost was their lives, their humanity. Stumbling back, Sebastián turned to run, but his legs felt like lead. His mind raced with thoughts of what he had just witnessed. He couldn't keep this secret, he couldn't let it fester. He had to tell someone, anyone. The horror of the scene weighed heavily on his chest, and as he made his way back to his village, he could barely contain his dread. The sound of the ritual echoed in his ears, and the image of Magdalena's unhinged eyes was burned into his mind. When Sebastián finally reached the village, he ran to the authorities, desperate to share the truth of what he had seen. But his frantic words were met with disbelief. The local police were slow to act, dismissing his claims as the ramblings of an overactive imagination. After all, who would believe such an outrageous story? The police officers knew of the cult, but they had no idea of its true nature, no inkling of the atrocities that lay beneath the surface of La Yerba Buena. Sebastián's panic was met with apathy, and the officers, skeptical of his tale, merely brushed him off. But Sebastián wouldn't give up. He knew the terror of what he had seen, and he couldn't ignore the faces of the villagers he knew, now trapped in Magdalena's web. He returned to the police station again and again, each time more insistent than the last. It wasn't until Officer Luis Martinez, a seasoned investigator known for his skepticism, took the matter seriously that the wheels of investigation began to turn. Sebastián's persistence finally wore down Martinez, who, though reluctant, agreed to take a closer look. Luis Martinez, a man used to handling the mundane cases of petty theft and disputes, couldn't fathom what Sebastián was claiming. Human sacrifice? A goddess in the caves? But something in Sebastián's eyes, something raw and frantic, told Martinez that the boy wasn't lying. He decided to accompany Sebastián, albeit with some trepidation, to the cave. Together, they would uncover the truth, or so they hoped. The air was thick with anticipation as they made their way toward the cave. Sebastián's heart beat erratically, and he could barely form words as he led the officer toward the entrance. Every step felt like a step deeper into the abyss. The closer they got, the more Sebastián's anxiety grew. He was terrified of what they would find, but he also knew that if they didn't act now, the bloodshed would continue. He had seen it with his own eyes. The villagers were pawns in Magdalena's sick game, and if the police didn't step in soon, it would be too late. The moment they arrived at the entrance, a deafening silence hung in the air. There was no sound of chanting, no rhythmic drumming, just the heavy breathing of Sebastián and Martinez. Both men stood frozen, unsure of what to expect. As they peered into the dark, the faint glow from the inner sanctum cast twisted shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The very air felt oppressive, as if the cave itself was alive with malice. But before they could act, a figure stepped into the light, Magdalena herself. Her eyes glowed with a feverish intensity as she glared at the two men. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. And then, as if on cue, the ritual began once more. Magdalena raised her knife, and the villagers moved in unison, their eyes glazed over with fear and devotion. This wasn't just a cult anymore, it was a nightmare, and it was all too real. Sebastián and Martinez knew they couldn't go back. They had to act now, or the cult's grip on La Yerba Buena would never end. But as the events unfolded before them, it became clear that confronting Magdalena would not be easy. The cult was not just a group of believers, it was an army, and they were all prepared to die for their goddess. As they stepped deeper into the cave, the tension between the two men mounted. The horrors that awaited them would test their resolve, and no one could say for certain what the cost of their involvement would be. But Sebastián was no longer just a scared boy, he was a witness, and he had come too far to turn back now. The police officer's gaze met Sebastián's, and in that moment, the gravity of the situation was clear. There was no turning back from this. They would either confront the darkness or become a part of it. With a final glance at each other, they plunged forward into the nightmare, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The air in La Yerba Buena was thick with tension. After weeks of evading suspicion, Sebastián Guerrero had finally convinced the local authorities that something was amiss in the mountains. The village, once a place of peace and simplicity, had become a breeding ground for fear. When Sebastián returned to the police with his grim discoveries, there was no longer any doubt that the cult, led by the enigmatic Magdalena Solis, had taken a dark and twisted hold on the people. At first, the authorities had dismissed Sebastián's frantic warnings. How could they believe such a wild tale of human sacrifice, of a goddess in the mountains, when no one had ever seen it firsthand? They told him to calm down, that it was simply the overactive imagination of a boy spooked by local superstitions. But Sebastián's resolve was unshakable. The horrors he had witnessed, the blood-soaked rituals in the cave, could not be ignored. The lives of the villagers hung in the balance, and he could no longer sit idly by. It wasn't until Officer Luis Martinez, a man who had seen his fair share of crime and chaos, began to believe him, that things started to move. Martinez, skeptical but curious, was no stranger to the darker sides of human nature. He had heard whispers of the cult, but nothing concrete, nothing that could justify taking action. Still, something in Sebastián's desperation pulled at him. This wasn't just another paranoid rambling, it was real. A plan was set into motion. The military was called in for backup, a necessary move considering the dangerous unpredictability of the cult members and their increasingly violent tendencies. The raid on La Yerba Buena began as the sun set behind the mountains, its last light casting long shadows over the narrow, dusty streets. The air crackled with an ominous energy as soldiers, armed to the teeth, marched through the village. Sebastián led them, though his steps were heavy with dread. He knew what lay ahead. He had seen the carnage firsthand, but now it was time for the truth to be exposed. As the team neared the cave's entrance, the silence was deafening. No one dared to speak. The soldiers, although trained for any number of violent encounters, could not have prepared themselves for what they would find in that cave. The faint sound of chanting echoed from deep within the earth, sending chills down their spines. The villagers, who had once been loyal followers, now cowered in fear, unwilling to challenge the goddess they had been led to worship. The raid was swift but brutal. Cult members, cornered and desperate to protect their leader, fought back with an intensity that shook the soldiers to their core. Gunfire rang out, piercing the stillness of the night, as the battle between the military and the cult raged. The Hernandez brothers, known to be fierce and loyal to Magdalena, fought to the bitter end, their bodies falling one after the other in the chaos. The military moved with precision, sweeping through the village and surrounding the cave, but not without cost. Several soldiers were injured, and the tension in the air was palpable as each passing moment drew the authorities closer to the heart of the terror. When the dust settled and the sounds of gunfire faded into silence, the soldiers moved into the cave. What they found there would haunt them forever. The scene inside was nothing short of horrific. The altar, once adorned with symbols of devotion to Magdalena, was now drenched in blood. The stone floors were slick with it, and the air stank of decay. Human remains lay scattered across the ground, some mutilated beyond recognition. The body of a young woman, bound and lifeless, was placed at the center, the final sacrifice in the cult's twisted rites. Magdalena Solis stood at the heart of the chaos, her eyes wild with madness. She had truly come to believe in her own divinity, her conviction so strong that it drove her to sacrifice everything, including the lives of those who had followed her. The soldiers moved quickly to arrest her, but there was no triumph in the act. This was not a moment of victory, it was a grim reminder of the power that belief could wield when twisted by fear and manipulation. As Magdalena was led out of the cave, shackled and broken, the villagers, those who had survived the violence, were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. Many of them had been coerced into the rituals, their lives a series of forced decisions made in the shadow of terror. Others had believed, truly believed, that Magdalena was the goddess she claimed to be, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Sebastián watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to feel relief, but the horrors he had witnessed could not be undone. The village, once his home, was now a scarred reminder of the madness that had taken root there. The cult was broken, but at what cost? The aftermath of the raid would be felt for years to come. The military and police, having faced down the terror of La Yerba Buena, now had to confront the psychological toll of the violence. For Sebastián, the young boy who had uncovered the truth, the weight of what he had seen would never truly leave him. He had lost his innocence, and the village he once knew would never be the same. But amidst the destruction, there was hope. The cult had been dismantled, its grip over the villagers broken. The survivors, those who had been forced into submission or were too afraid to act, could now begin to rebuild their lives. But it would take time. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take years to heal. As the military and police departed, leaving La Yerba Buena behind, there was an uneasy calm in the air. The darkness had been confronted, but there were always shadows waiting to take its place. And as for Sebastián, he would never forget the night the truth was uncovered. It had been a night of bloodshed and terror, but also of courage, a night that marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. The aftermath of the raid on La Yerba Buena left a broken community, but the truth had finally been laid bare. The cult, once hidden in the shadows of the mountains, was now exposed, its leaders arrested, and the survivors forced to confront the horrors they had been a part of. The fate of Magdalena Solis and the Hernandez brothers was sealed, and the ripple effects of their actions would haunt the villagers for years to come. Magdalena was arrested with little resistance, her belief in her own divine status shattered in an instant. As the authorities led her away in chains, she appeared both broken and defiant. She had once seen herself as a goddess, but now, in the face of justice, she was nothing more than a criminal. The trials were swift, the evidence undeniable. Magdalena was sentenced to life in prison for her role in the horrific blood rituals that had claimed the lives of many innocent people. Her conviction was a grim reminder of the dangers of blind faith and manipulation. Her brother, the notorious Hernandez brothers, had also met their fate. Juan and Pedro Hernandez had been her most loyal followers, carrying out her commands without question. In the chaos of the shootout, both brothers were killed, their bodies found among the wreckage of their twisted reign. Their death brought an end to the immediate threat, but the psychological scars they left on the community would take much longer to heal. The villagers, those who had once worshipped Magdalena as a goddess, were left in a state of shock. Many had been coerced into participating in the gruesome rituals, their lives manipulated by fear and false promises of salvation. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Some villagers, now freed from the cult's grip, faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives. The trauma they had endured would leave them scarred forever, unable to forget the horrors they had witnessed. For others, the psychological toll was even greater. Some villagers had willingly embraced the cult's teachings, believing in Magdalena's divine power. To them, the truth was even more difficult to accept. How could they have been so blind? The emotional and psychological damage would linger long after the physical wounds had healed. Trust, once shattered, would take years to rebuild, if it could ever be rebuilt at all. The legacy of the cult's terror would become a dark chapter in the history of La Yerba Buena. The village, once peaceful and isolated, had been irrevocably changed. Its residents had been torn apart by the lies of a woman who had exploited their vulnerabilities for her own gain. The aftermath of the raid left the community broken, but it also offered a glimmer of hope. The survivors had the chance to rebuild their lives, free from the cult's hold. However, the true impact of the cult's existence would never fade. The events of La Yerba Buena would live on in the memories of the villagers, a constant reminder of the darkness that can take root in the most unsuspecting places. It was a cautionary tale, one that would echo through the years, warning future generations of the dangers of blind faith and manipulation. As for Magdalena, her trial marked the end of her reign of terror, but it also raised questions about the nature of belief and power. What made her so convincing? How did she bend so many to her will? The answers were complex, rooted in psychology and human nature. But one thing was certain, the horrors of La Yerba Buena would never be forgotten. The cult's legacy was now part of a larger narrative, a chilling reminder that true crime stories, no matter how strange, often contain unsettling truths about the fragility of the human mind and the power of influence.